What kind of limits keep us stuck? I'm glad you're here for this conversation today. Hi, I'm Rob, and it's great to be able to catch up with you for a few moments here today. We mentioned our interactive teaching videos that are available for kids and families, and starting this month, our posts have moved to YouTube. And so if you're searching for them on YouTube, you need to look for Kingston Standard Church Cabin Kids. You'll find the links for the YouTube videos still on our Facebook page as well. And our focus here in these videos is directly related to the themes and the scriptures of our family videos. We know it can be hard to open faith conversations at home, and so we want to create an open door for dialogue that can happen in our homes and for people of all ages as we follow Jesus together. I'd invite you to connect with us online or in person. There is a link in the description box of this video that will connect you to our website. I'd invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel or like or follow us on Facebook. And you can connect with us online if you want to message us through Facebook Messenger, or if you'd like to email us at the address that's listed below. We would love to pray for you, to see if there are any questions you may have or comments, if there's some way that we can continue to walk with you in your journey with Jesus. Now, what we do in the moments where life calls us to step up is really telling, isn't it? Joshua, Caleb, David, Daniel, Esther, these are all people in the scripture that stepped up and trusted God, found the courage to deal with very difficult circumstances. God sometimes asks us to take a risk and to do something we might not feel totally prepared to do. But God will also give us the courage we need to face that challenge as we choose to follow God's plan, even when we're afraid. So let's have a look and see what we can discover as we jump in today. We all tend to like labels. They can often make life a lot easier. If a jar says poison, well, it can quickly save a life, right? If it says gluten-free, then it's safe for someone who needs that option. Labels, they help us. They help us make quick decisions about certain things, and in a lot of cases, that's good. But the problem is, we sometimes slap labels on people too, don't we? I've experienced this a lot. It's really interesting to meet new people who have no idea what I do for work. And when we meet out in public, maybe it's at a rink or a social setting or something along that line, there is a moment in time that comes up where they discover, you're a pastor? There are some moments that I wish I could have a picture of the looks on their faces. As one author describes it, sometimes you'd think you'd thrown a skunk into the room. In one instance, I was at a buddy's house, and we were there for one of his kids' birthday parties. This was the first time I was going to meet his father. And so I stepped up and shook my friend's dad's hand, and he made kind of a strange, offhanded statement. I laughed it off and moved on. It wouldn't have been a total of maybe even 30 seconds later, though. He comes barreling through the door, and as it is a straight line to me to say, oh, Father, I'm so sorry. I have so much respect for men of the cloth. Someone had obviously told him I was a pastor. I laughed inside as he spent the next 20 minutes to a half an hour trying to backpedal and relive that whole moment where we first met in order to redeem himself. I didn't encounter him often as a regular contact, but I might see him once or twice a year, and it seemed like it took him 5 or 6 years of encounters worth to be able to feel like he could stop apologizing for that initial exchange. Because when people discover I'm a pastor, they put this label on me. They sometimes think they need to treat me differently, or they wonder, well, maybe they've said something bad that they need to apologize for. Maybe they've had a bad experience with a pastor and they somehow project that on me, and sometimes there's even a mindset among people that think that pastors have this like superpower X-ray vision, that they can see right through them and all of the guilt that is a part of their lives is evident to us. Sometimes it can be a really big barrier in connecting with people. Isn't it strange how we sometimes label people around us and then behave differently around them? This can be related to a whole bunch of different situations, and we acquire labels through a variety of settings. Sometimes it's because of the work we do. Think about your image of a label when I say car salesman, or politician, or unskilled worker. Or maybe you've found a label that's been kind of part of your life because somebody labeled you when they were angry. They maybe called you a troublemaker, or that you're always creating problems, or that you were so lazy, or that they couldn't believe how selfish you were in that moment. It may be a label that sometimes we've adopted for ourselves, and you find yourself in a setting and you're like, I'm actually better than these people. Or maybe it's a label like, I'm just a worker. Maybe a manager, but I don't really have that great of an influence over people. Maybe it's a label like, I'm not that important. Nobody likes to be labeled. But there are labels that we live with, and then there are labels that we can lay on others. And we all have to deal with them, and it's clear to us that labels do create limits that can keep us stuck. But there's also the way that we may end up limiting the work and the wonders of God with labels that we either choose to give or labels we choose to live with. Now today, as we look at the scripture, we're going to see how so often labels will limit our view and how dangerous they are, and how in our lives God longs to help us grow beyond some of those labels. We've been working through the big story that God is unfolding that started with creation and moved through the family of Abraham, and now we see generations down the line, and this character many of us have heard of. Maybe we even may think we've got him all figured out, but he's a well-known descendant of Abraham, and his name is David. We may know him as King David. He had his share of ups and downs in life, and the people of Israel, before we meet David, had said that they wanted a king. This was a wholesale rejection of God as their authority and their ruler, and so Saul becomes the first king of Israel. Samuel the prophet anoints him at God's direction. He was an impressive person. He was tall and strong and powerful, a man of action, all of the things that kind of qualified the kings of the day. And this is what Israel wanted. They wanted to have a king like the other kings of the nations around them. But unfortunately, Saul didn't stay loyal to God. And God shares with Samuel that the kingdom is going to be passed to another person outside of Saul's family. And so we pick up this exchange with Samuel as we meet David for the first time in 1 Samuel chapter 16. And watch as we're reading for some of the labels that are being dropped here. Now the Lord said to Samuel, "You've mourned long enough for Saul. I've rejected him as king of Israel. So fill your flask with olive oil and go to Bethlehem. Find a man named Jesse who lives there, for I have selected one of his sons to be my king." But Samuel asked, well, how can I do that? If Saul hears about it, he will kill me. "Take a heifer with you," the Lord replied, "and say that you have come to make a sacrifice to the Lord. Invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you which of his sons to anoint for me." So Samuel did as the Lord instructed. When he arrived in Bethlehem, the elders of the town came trembling to meet him. "What's wrong?" they asked. "Do you come in peace?" "Yes," Samuel replied, "I've come to sacrifice to the Lord. Purify yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice." Then Samuel performed the purification rite for Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice too. When they arrived, Samuel took one look at Eliab and thought, "Surely "This is the Lord's anointed." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Don't judge by his appearance or height, for I've rejected him." The Lord doesn't see things the way you see them. People judge by outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Then Jesse told his son Abinadab to step forward and walk in front of Samuel, but Samuel said, "This is not the one the Lord has chosen." Next, Jesse summoned Shemaiah, but Samuel said, "Neither is this one the Lord has chosen." In the same way, all 7 of Jesse's sons were presented to Samuel, but Samuel said to Jesse, "The Lord has not chosen any of these." Then Samuel asked, "Are these all the sons you have?" "Well, there still is the youngest," Jesse replied, "but he's out in the fields, watching the sheep and goats." "Send for him at once," Samuel said. "We won't sit down and eat until he arrives." So Jesse sent for him, and he was dark and handsome with beautiful eyes. And the Lord said, "This is the one. Anoint him." So as David stood there among his brothers, Samuel took the flask of olive oil that he had brought and anointed David with the oil. And the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David from that day on. Then Samuel returned to Ramah. Now, this description of David in the Bible is an intentional contrast between what Saul looks like and what David looks like. Saul is a powerful looking person, as we mentioned, and David is anything but powerful looking. It's not significant enough already that his father initially didn't even bother calling him in from the fields to meet Samuel. His father had kind of labeled him as unimportant. Yet David's impact was significant, as we know. And we love what God says to Samuel in verse 7. The Lord doesn't see things the way you see them. People judge by outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. So what is it that God saw in David's heart? I've mentioned my grandfather before, who experienced in his latter years macular degeneration. And maybe you know somebody who's experienced this. For him, he could see some things around this growing black spot that was in the center of his vision, and it became irresistible to focus in on, and all he could not see as a result. And what he needed as time went on in his life was someone who would help him to be able to see what was really there, to describe what was in front of him so that he could function a little better. Sometimes when it involved signing his name, he could see parts of it, but he needed a description to be able to walk through what it meant. This is what this looks like. And he could understand from the description what he needed to do. Now, I thought different times, wouldn't it be awesome if we had the power to make that spot shrink? That he'd be able to see things that he hadn't seen for quite some time, to appreciate them in a whole new way, right? I mean, that's kind of what happens on a lesser scale when we get a new set of glasses, or maybe if you've ever had cataracts that have been taken care of, or some other kind of surgery with your eyes. Labels are a lot like that. They create a blurred or even a blockage in your view. And they create moments that help us to feel stuck. When they're lifted, we get to see things in a whole new way. So as we look around at what's going on in the life of David, we see the confidence that he has in the days to come, and there's a lot of information in the scripture about his life. Some of it we find in the Psalms and his writings from the time he was a shepherd. We see the heart of this young man who had grown over time to hear what God had to say in his life. And these significant moments that come up in his days, well, David had learned to trust God with the impossible, even though his own father initially overlooked him, didn't think he was significant enough to even call in from the fields to be part of the sacrifice. And it helps us to see that we don't want to limit God's work with a label, because it's a dangerous place when we can come into complete disregard for the work of God because we have labeled it impossible. And we don't want to limit God's work with labels. Now, David had a lot of moments in his life. As we mentioned, we can see them in Psalms where he was out with the sheep. And maybe instead of playing a game on his phone or watching YouTube videos, I would suggest to you that in that time, David was actually investing some of that time in learning how to listen to God. During that time, God gave him perspective as to who David really was. And even though his father may have underestimated him and his brothers considered him a pesky runt of a brother, that big dark spot that would have maybe grown as others labeled him across the years, because David had learned to listen to God, well, the things that God said about David were what was in focus, what he understood life as a result of. And it became easier and easier to focus when the labels started flying around. Because when we discover, as we spend time with God, listening to who he is and listening to who he says we are, we have the confidence of the true self God has designed into us. When we discover that as we spend time listening to God, what we discover is the confidence of the true self that God has designed. When we label ourselves, often we do that as a result of failures or frustrations that happen in our lives. Others label us because of snapshots of some of our actions, and they turn us into objects instead of people who are actually growing and learning through time. They freeze us in time with a label. And on the other hand, God calls us by name, as he did with David. He reminds us that we belong to him, and he helps us to see that there is healing that we can find in him. But God also tells us some of the hard truths. Maybe we've done some things that are lazy or selfish. Maybe we've lied or stolen. Maybe we've sought to control people or manipulate things. As we make time to listen to God, he guides us out of those ruts and out of those places in our lives. And he doesn't just give us this pep talk and kind of shoo us on our way. As we really allow what God says to sink in, it becomes larger than the label. And labels start to not stick quite as well. Each time we listen to them, it's like the sticky part of a label somebody has shoved on us loses its hold in our lives. And we're no longer pasted up with labels. Our vision isn't blocked up by them, but we're truly visible to be seen as the people that he's created us to be. It's dangerous when we limit God's work with a label, but it's tragic when we stay there and don't listen to what God has to say about who we are. And as God defines who we are, well, he puts us in places where we can trust him for things that sometimes seem impossible. That's what we understand as we look on at what was happening in the life of David. He was just kind of caught up in the mundane daily grind of taking care of the sheep, but as he does his job well, he also learned to take time to listen to God. And in the process, God prepared him to shed the labels, to be able to focus on what God said about him, and to be ready to be part of the impossible. So as we look at this moment in David's life we just read about, God identified what he's been doing in David, how he's been shaping him to this point. But he also identifies what he's got in store for David. And the next account in David's life is really familiar. It's kind of one of those things that even in our common culture, we have expressions related to it, like facing our giants, or there's a David and Goliath kind of battle that is before us. It's kind of how God reveals the work that he's been doing in David during those times that he's spent alone in the fields. This is the heart that God saw when he said, I look at something that's deeper than what you look at on the outside. So now David also sees outside the labels, and he steps up in confidence, and we see this in chapter 17 of 1 Samuel. It says, the Philistines now mustered their army for battle, and they camped between Socoh in Judah and Azekah in Ephes-dammim. Saul countered by gathering his Israelite troops near the valley of Elah. So the Philistines and the Israelites faced each other on opposite hills with the valley between them. Then Goliath, a Philistine champion from Gath, came out of the Philistine ranks to face the forces of Israel. He was over 9 feet tall. He wore a bronze helmet, and his bronze coat of mail weighed 125 pounds. He was also wearing bronze leg armor, and he carried a bronze javelin on his shoulder. The shaft of his spear was as heavy and thick as a weaver's beam, tipped with an iron spearhead that weighed 15 pounds. His armor-bearer walked ahead of him, carrying a shield. Goliath stood and shouted a taunt across to the Israelites. "Why are you all coming out to fight?" he called. "I am the Philistine champion, but you are only the servants of Saul. Choose one man to come down here and fight me. If he kills me, then we will be your slaves. And if I kill him, you will be our slaves. I defy the armies of Israel today. Send me a man who will fight me." When Saul and the Israelites heard this, they were terrified, and they were deeply shaken. Now, as you may know, in the interim verses here, David's 3 brothers were part of Saul's army. David is an errand boy for his father and his brothers, who's taking supplies back and forth from the front and taking care of the sheep when he's back home. David is taking supplies this one day, and Goliath has been stepping up for the last 40 days with his taunt, and David experiences this taunt and starts asking about the situation with some questions that his brother thinks are just a little too forward for him to be asking. Let's jump back in at verse 28 in chapter 17. But when David's oldest brother, Eliab, heard David talking to the men, he was angry. "What are you doing around here anyway?" he demanded. "What about those few sheep you're supposed to be taking care of? I know about your pride and deceit. You just want to see the battle." "What have I done now?" Sounds like just about any runt brother, right? David replied, "I was only asking a question." He walked over to some others and asked them the same thing and received the same answer. Then David's question was reported to King Saul, and the king sent for him. "Don't worry about this Philistine," David told Saul. "I'll go fight him." "Don't be ridiculous," Saul replied. "There's no way you can fight this Philistine and possibly win. You're only a boy, and he's been a man of war since his youth." David persisted. "I've been taking care of my father's sheep and goats," he said. "And when a lion or a bear comes to steal a lamb from the flock, I go after it with a club and rescue the lamb from its mouth. If the animal turns on me, I catch it by the jaw and club it to death. I've done this to both lions and bears, and I'll do it to this pagan Philistine too. For he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the claws of the lion and the bear will rescue me from this Philistine." Saul finally consented. "All right, go ahead," he said, "and may the Lord be with you." Then Saul gave David his own armor, a bronze helmet, and a coat of mail. David put it on, strapped a sword over it, and took a step or two to see what it was like, and he had never worn anything like this before. "I can't go in these," he protested to Saul. "I'm not used to them." So David took them off again. He picked up 5 smooth stones from a stream and put them in a shepherd's bag. Then, armed with only his shepherd's staff and a sling, he started across the valley to fight the Philistine. Goliath walked out toward David with his shield bearer ahead of him, sneering in contempt at this ruddy-faced boy. "Am I a dog," he roared at David, "that you come at me with a stick?" Then he cursed David by the names of his gods. "Come over here, and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals," Goliath yelled. David replied to the Philistine, "You come at me with sword, spear, and javelin, but I come at you in the name of the Lord of heaven's armies, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. Today the Lord will conquer you, and I will kill you and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of your men to the birds and the wild animals. And the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. And everyone assembled here will know that the Lord rescues his people. But not with sword and spear. This is the Lord's battle, and he will give you to us. As Goliath moved closer to attack, David quickly ran out to meet him. Reaching into his shepherd's bag and taking out a stone, he hurled it with his sling and hit the Philistine in the forehead. The stone sank in, and Goliath stumbled and fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with only a sling and a stone, for he had no sword. Then David ran over and pulled Goliath's sword from its sheath. David used it to kill him and cut off his head. When the Israelites saw that their champion was dead, they turned and ran. Now, we love this moment right here. I mean, we can see ourselves in David, where the small kind of person in the puzzle kind of faces the big challenges of life and deals with them in a way that wins out in the end. This is a huge theme through the whole Bible, isn't it? The things that we often face are fearsome, terrifying, sometimes very powerful, and they just don't go away. Sometimes they just keep coming the way Goliath did. And sometimes the things that we deal with are actually the labels that we let cloud the picture God wants to share with us. Sometimes they sound like, I'm just not educated enough. I'm just not creative enough. I don't have enough money. I don't have enough time. I don't have enough experience. I'm not ready yet. I don't know where to start. It's too hard. I'm just not good enough. I'm too old. It's not the right time. Nobody believes in me. I don't think people will accept me. I'm afraid I'll mess up. I don't know the right people. I've tried and it just can't be done. I just can't deal with all the problems. Now, the journey for David also becomes the journey for us, of seeing past those labels, the way God sees us. God is always looking below the surface at our heart. And as we listen to him and allow our confidence to be built up as he talks with us about who we are, as we trust him and as we grow into what he says about us, we can step up when things seem impossible. Now, it would be incredible if we could just be zapped with that insight, wouldn't it? There are moments, though, that God does do that in our lives, where he heals the way words have wounded us, where he gives us a new view on life. Oftentimes, it's in a very specific kind of a way, but more often, he takes us on a journey of learning to listen to hear his voice, the way David did. And as he shares with us what is real and who we really are, we learn to trust him instead of trusting the label that clouds our view. Many of us know listening to God really starts with diving into and reading his word, spending time in prayer. And this can sometimes seem really ominous, sometimes a little challenging, maybe an overwhelming task. And if you're in that camp today, that you're trying to sort that out, we'd love to walk with you through some coaching to continue to get started, or even continue to grow in this part of the very important journey that we each have with Jesus. So we'd invite you to email and start a personalized conversation. We've mentioned how you can do that through Facebook Messenger or through the email address that we're going to put on the screen a little bit later in this video. But the big picture of David's life is this. No one thought David would ever be king. No one ever pictured him as king. They'd kind of written him off. They left him in the fields in the first place. And no one thought that David would ever defeat a giant Goliath. You heard Saul's response, "You're just a boy." But God had built David, and it had happened during many of those long-needed quiet times alone. And he allowed him to see past the labels to something that was possible only because of God. into what looks like was completely impossible. And we need to remember this, that labels create limits. They create limits in our lives. They create limits in the lives of others. And it's critical for us to learn to listen to who God says we are, so that we don't limit God's work with a label. Let me pray with us today. God, we come to you and we acknowledge that there are a lot of times labels that cloud our vision. They kind of become things that we trust more than we trust you. And so, God, we ask that you would help us to take steps, active steps in our daily lives, to create space to listen to you, to create space to hear your voice, to create space to hear what you say about us, to allow you to define us. That begins as we spend time in prayer, as we spend time in your word. It continues as we understand and learn to hear your voice together in day-to-day conversations. We're thankful for the way that you want to communicate this to us and allow labels to just kind of drop off of us or cease to cloud our vision. Forgive us for the way we sometimes trust those labels. And however we've arrived at them, God, I pray that your voice would be the voice that we listen to louder and stronger than any other voice in our lives. Help us to grow to that place, Jesus. And as we come to you, we acknowledge that in the middle of moments that we face that look like they're impossible, that keep barraging us again and again and again, that we really need to be able to see life the way you see life. And so we thank you and we praise you. I pray that you'd help us not to fall into the danger of limiting your work with labels in our lives or in others. In your name I pray. Amen. Thanks again for taking this time to share together with us today. And again, let me invite you to connect with us online or in person if you're here in the Kingston area. If you're connecting with us online, then feel free to message us through Facebook Messenger or the email address that's on the screen. As I mentioned earlier in the message, it would be great to be able to connect with you if you're growing in your understanding of what it means to connect with God, to listen to Him rather than the labels that people or you may have put on yourself. Or if you're even trying to get started in that journey, then feel free to connect with us in that way. We'd love to hear how we can pray for you. If you have any questions or comments along the way, feel free to message us. There's a link in the description box that will connect you to our website. I'd invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel or to like or follow us on Facebook. And before you go, if you don't mind taking just a moment to like, comment, or share about this video, it's always an encouragement for us when you do. Farewell. We'll be praying for you, and we trust you're praying for us too. We look forward to seeing you all again soon.